Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to HBK's monthly webinar risk advisory series. My name is Bill Heaven. I'm a senior director here at HBK. This morning, we're going to talk about data destruction. We have two experts with us that have presented. It's been a couple years now, so I wanted to get them in front of us again. But Jennifer Lamar and Kevin Lamar from Northern Shore Services are going to help me out today. So I want to do some logistics here for everyone, and then I'll turn it over to them. So here's our agenda for this morning. Just a real brief agenda and a couple housekeeping issues. So we've muted all the incoming lines today. So we are experiencing monitoring, I should say, the chat window. So if you're having any issues, please type it in there. One point of advice I would give everybody is if the webinar starts acting up a little bit, the first thing I would do is go to the browser and refresh. So that would be the first thing to try. And other than that, if you can communicate by typing, put something in the Q&A box, and we are watching that, and we'll try to address whatever issue you're having. We're going to try to leave about 5 minutes or so at the end of the presentation to do questions. But if you have a question, just put it in the Q&A box, and we'll try to address it during the webinar. But if not, we'll circle back with you at the end. And if we run out of time at the end, we'll address your concern via email. So those are some things. We're going to put a copy of the slide deck that you can download, and as well, Michelle will send out a copy of the slide deck along with the recording. So if you have any colleagues that weren't able to join us today, you can forward that on to them, or you can rewatch or listen to the webinar at your leisure as well. This slide is our learning objectives. This is new in the past couple of years, where we've put in what your takeaways for the webinar will be. So this is what you should be able to know after attending today's webinar. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail and read them for you. I'll let you do that at your leisure, but pretty straightforward objectives for today's session. Again, as I've said before, I've been with HBK. I have a dual role here. I do some external work, which is part of the risk advisory webinar series, also consulting with clients, as well as I have the majority of my responsibility at HBK is to do internal IT security work. So that's what takes up most of my time, but I've been here for just over 5 years now. So again, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin and Jennifer here shortly, but this is a little bit of a bio on their background, and I'll click the next slide and let them take over and tell you a little bit about Northern Shore Services, and then go into the webinar as far as giving us some information on coming up on data destruction and how we can do it in our own companies, having policies and procedures to take things over. So I'll just turn it over to you, Jennifer and Kevin, and you can take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Wanted to thank Bill and Michelle for setting up this presentation, and also to Hilberth and King for giving us the opportunity to present. Jennifer and I have been running Northern Shore Services for a number of years now. It's been an interesting journey in that we work with a lot of small, medium-sized clients. In fact, we were on a job yesterday down in Amish country in Ohio with a company down there. But we've been exposed to a lot of different industries, both government and for-profit and non-for-profit. And primarily what we do, and just a short comment on us because it dovetails into what we're going to talk about in a little bit, is we primarily focus on our clients' data and what they want managed as far as sanitized, wiped, cleared, destroyed. Of course, we take care of IT assets and recycling monitors and laptops and desktops, but more so the data is our focus. And what we have found through some of our clients is what they like as far as our services is that we give them the option whether to erase data either on-site or off-site, meaning at our client's office or back at our plant. We also talk to them about what steps or what documentation they want for whatever their policies, procedures, or lack thereof that they would want us to put in place for them. Now, what we try to stress with our clients, and we'll talk about more later, is making sure that there's an auditable reporting in that God forbid, one of our clients is questioned on the whereabouts of some hard drives or IT hardware, that they have a clear inventory listing of what's been destroyed, what the date is, and how it was destroyed. And we feel like that helps keep them out of any challenges or issues, and also provides a good service on our end as well. Some of the services that we offer, because a number of our clients ask us, well, what do you actually do? Well, we erase data, we actually physically destroy data, and we also provide the reporting in case you're asked about that later. The recycling of IT assets, we do that, and we do handle multiple facility locations too. So I guess to jump into the first topic, hate to start off with an ugly situation, but this subject or this topic has come up a number of times in different presentations. And the Morgan Stanley case is one in which the OCC assessed a $60 million civil penalty regarding that. And what had happened is that Morgan Stanley ended up hiring a moving company rather than a data destruction company. There was a total breakdown in how that job was handled. So to back up, Morgan Stanley had a data processing center that they were decommissioning, and they hired a company to remove the drives, but they dropped the ball in that they didn't clearly specify that they wanted the drives erased and they wanted all data removed from them in addition to the data center being decommissioned. So two vendors down the road ended up receiving these drives and ended up selling them on the secondary market. And when those drives were sold, the purchasers opened up those drives and found Morgan Stanley client data, personal financial statements, account information on it, and that created the civil penalty and all the trouble. And to make it even worse, Morgan Stanley didn't do it once. 2 years later, they did it again. We were presenting at a national convention back in April, and this civil penalty case came up again where they were reporting more information regarding it. So we hate to bring up a terrible situation, but that's why we feel that this topic is important, and we wanted to cover it a little more in detail. So the first CPE question is on the screen now. A $60 million civil penalty from the OCC was assessed against the following businesses. So we'll give you a few minutes to answer that.
Hey, Kevin, with that OCC case, I know we talked about that in the past, but talking about deja vu. So when you guys are out working with clients, how frequently do you have to reiterate or retell somebody or break the bad news to them that when they think they delete data on their computer, they're really not deleting it, which is a key reason why you guys need to come in and help people because the deletion just kind of removes the directions to get to the data. It keeps the data there. And then secondly, are copiers still a big issue where the copier, every time it makes a copy of like sensitive data, it's storing that on a disk drive that goes with that copier when it leaves your office? Are those two questions still big with what you guys are seeing?
I could answer the first one, Bill. We definitely almost all the time have to explain to people about not using reformatting or deleting files as an end means to get rid of their data. I believe a long time ago, everyone thought that that would be sufficient, but and you would hope that people are a little more informed at this point, but it still does happen all the time, that people do not realize that those are acceptable methods of getting rid of anything. So especially if you're not reusing your drives and disks or whatever back in your own organization, and you want to repurpose them outside of your organization, like donating or what have you. So you hate to bring people bad news, but I guess in a way, if they're interacting with us at that point, you could save them a lot of grief, by educating them further. Kev, do you want to handle the copier issue?
Yeah, Bill, with copiers, we run into those very rarely. I mean, there are drives or data-bearing assets within those. We advise our clients to contact the manufacturers or the leasing company that maybe the copier is coming off lease in order to direct them to where that drive is located. That's probably the best solution. And when we're talking with our clients.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. I know that used to be a big thing that kind of caught me off guard, but I'm guessing that it's not, with that being such a big problem a few years back, I'm sure that there's been some things done to kind of make that not as big of a deal anymore. So hopefully that's the case, but thanks.
Well, you bring up a great point, and I don't want to detract from the slide, but to put everybody on notice, it's not just copiers anymore. It's your refrigerator, it's your thermostat, it's your vehicle. It's a number of consumer items that we use every day, in addition to office copiers, that are actually housing data that we don't even realize. So it's a bigger problem in the future and now than I think a lot of us realize.
Interesting. Thanks.
Sure. Jumping on the screen here, conversations surrounding data destruction. We wanted to set the stage. What are the situations that companies might be facing that would cause you to think about data destruction? One is a new technology in the marketplace. Everyone wants to upgrade to the newest computer or to the newest tech. You have equipment that comes off a lease and needs to be upgraded. That's usually a trigger point. With remote work and staffing levels and office locations, that causes a lot of shuffling as far as IT assets and how to recycle or remove data. And also any revisions to business models as far as how you're running your company and new software that's being stored, whether the data is housed locally or offsite at different data centers. So some of the factors to consider, and I won't go into detail, but just highlighting them, is if you're set with a situation of how to assess your data and your asset recycling, just highlight the space, the conditions, the time, the security, and the convenience. And in those 5 bullet points, you want to definitely talk about the space that you're utilizing and how to reduce it, some of the conditions as far as your business situation and how you can alleviate some old IT assets. Security is always the focus, and also making it convenient and reducing the time spent. Those are all items to give some more thought to. This is an interesting slide here that, number one, keep in mind that if you delete files or format or reset, that doesn't actually remove the data from your computer. And what's really important is that cybersecurity is just paramount to running your company. But that's when the data is in its active life cycle. But what we focus on is when the data is not in an active life cycle and the assets are being retired or recycled. That's where data destruction comes into play. With that, I will turn it over to Jennifer regarding some terms and definitions.
So this slide just highlights some of the general basic terms and definitions of the industry. And so we'll start with number one, just media versus data. The important part here is that media is the physical platform, such as the drives, where the information is stored, and data is the actual information itself. Data destruction is the process of removing the data found on the media by rendering the data inaccessible. But media destruction is when the actual media is destroyed in order to get rid of the data that it contains. So data wiping is when you remove the data from the media by overwriting it with meaningless data across the entire storage area. And that leaves the media intact and functional for perhaps for future reuse, if that's what you're trying to accomplish. Now, we're next a few different types of media. There's HDDs, the hard drives, which have they have actual metal spinning platters that move around inside of it. Those are the ones that are sometimes a little larger. The 3.5 inch look like maybe the size of a paperback book. 2.5 inches, about the size of a deck of cards. Then there's these SSDs, the solid state drives. They do not have the platters moving around. They have no moving parts at all. And then there's different types of flash media, which have the chips that they use to store data instead of the platters. Now, you're wondering, why is any of this important? But it is because you have to understand the difference between the type of media that you have. And that determines if you're doing physical destruction, what method you need to use. Not every method is effective for each type of media, and we'll cover that a little more later. So we're talking about developing a data destruction policy, and the driving factor in all of this is the NIST publication, the 800-88 Rev 1, and the official title is Guidelines for Media Sanitization. So NIST was published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and interestingly enough, NIST is a division of the U.S. Department of Commerce. This revision was from December of 2014, but as like most things with the government, it does not change extremely often, and so that is the most recent update, actually. What it does is provide general instruction for the acceptable sanitization methods, and it's intended as a guideline for the development of your data destruction policy for your organization. The general objective of the document is to assist with decision-making when your media needs to be disposed of or reused or will actually be leaving your organization. So NIST defines the responsibility of the information owner, which would be your organization, is that 2 steps. Number 1, identify the data categories and the confidentiality level of the data. And then number 2, determine the level of media sanitization required for your organization. Now, since only you're most familiar with the data of your organization, then only you can actually determine what's best for your specific needs. So as Kevin mentioned before, that information disposition, those decisions occur throughout the entire information system life cycle, but they're usually most intense during the end of life phase, meaning when you're ready to get rid of an asset or a drive. Therefore, it's essential to protect your used media. We hear a lot about cybersecurity, and that's extremely important. But the second part of that is that when you're ready to get rid of your assets, you need to know what to do with those assets in the media. So to decide on the appropriate method of destruction for you, you should, according to NIST, categorize the security level of the information, assess the media on which it's stored. So are your drives older? Are they smaller capacity drives, in which case those types of drives are easier to replace? or if they're newer drives that you just spent a whole lot of money for storage, you might want to try to repurpose those. Number 3, evaluate your risk to the confidentiality, which is extremely important as far as once you've categorized the security level of the information, you have to decide how important it is to you if something should happen and that gets accidentally released, that data. And number 4, determine the future of the media. Again, donate, reuse, destroy. So the method that you select has to be appraised according to different factors like the cost and the environment and so on and so forth. But the ultimate decision always should be, first and foremost, choose what best mitigates the risks to unauthorized disclosure of your information. That would be the main goal of any policy that you would develop. So all of that is a great guideline in government speak, but we're going to break down a little bit about what more that actually means to your actual policy. So here are some things to consider when you're trying to figure out what you want to do with your media and your assets. Number 1 would be the type and the storage capacity you're dealing with. So if you have CDs still around, which some people still do, or the magnetic hard drives, or the flash memory solid state drives, which are obviously much more prevalent these days, all of those require different types of physical destruction. What works for one won't necessarily work for another. So you have to evaluate what media you have. Also, if you have an older drive that has a little bit of a larger capacity, like a hard drive or even a newer one with a large capacity, it takes a lot more time to overwrite that information than if you were to have a smaller capacity drive. The next thing to consider is the security and the confidentiality of the data. So basically, what kind of information is being considered when you're looking at a drive? Are there personnel files, financial information, medical records, confidential meeting minutes, those type of things? You have to know what's on that drive. Next is the physical location of the media. Is it being held right at this moment in a secure, controlled area so that people can't get to it at any given time? Are the drives loose? Are they contained in computer units? Those are things to consider because obviously it's much easier to lose or misplace a single drive than it is an actual desktop or a laptop. Then you have to consider the personnel performing your sanitization. Do you have the staff that is able to do that, to do the data destruction? Or should you actually look at that as something you could outsource to save you time in the long run? Some further considerations are the volume of the media. Do you have 10 drives? Do you have dozens of drives, hundreds of drives? We see lots of places that sort of put everything in a back closet for a long time, and then one day you open it up and realize that everybody's been dumping things there, and you have all sorts of media to handle. Then do you have the availability of the equipment that's needed for the data destruction? Sometimes a lot of organizations don't have that in-house, the equipment. Training level of the personnel. Is the person that you test with performing all this data destruction familiar with the process? And do they have the time, basically, to go ahead and tackle this task? Because obviously, like a data erasure for an SSD can be accomplished in about 5 minutes, and a lot of times even less than that. But if you have a large capacity hard drive with the spinning platters, say maybe a 2 terabyte, that could take hours, probably upwards of 5 to 7 hours, depending on the write speed, to erase something like that. And then finally, you want to look at the total cost involved with the whole process, so the cost of the equipment and the software you would need, and the cost of training your employees, because that's obviously time and money also.
Okay, so the next CPE question, NIST is an agency of what government entity?
Hey Kevin, while they're doing the question there, so do you guys, when people hire you, do you get a lot of customers from like certain industries? Like I would think it would be all industries because everybody has sensitive data, but I mean, do you see more like in the financial or healthcare, or do you really not see any patterns there?
It seems to cross all sides, all ends, I guess. Manufacturing, some, but not as much. Government entities, definitely. Managed service providers have a number of clients that they have in a variety of businesses. But we've noticed, surprisingly, it's not the industry. It just is the individual makeup of those leaders of those entities. Good case in point. A major company in Youngstown does not destroy any of their data. We've talked to them about it. They said, we prefer to lock every hard drive up in a vault, and we don't want to destroy anything. Also, a local municipality in the Tri-County area of Ohio, they take their hard drives and give them to a police department, and they use them for target practice. So we also have another government municipality that prefers to put all their hard drives in the back of a car, drive them down to Columbus, have them shredded there, and they receive a piece of paper that says we've shredded 100 drives with no serial numbers, no information. So it's odd. It's like the industries you think that would be the most focused or care about it. It all depends on who's leading those organizations and if they feel that data destruction is important.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because, like I said in my question, it would be all industries or whatever, because everybody's going to have the sensitive data, and I would even suspect that, you know, because the bad guys are so lazy that they would, you know, purposely target some of the like manufacturing. There's got to be a treasure trove of information, if not just from intellectual property, that, you know, they might go after those easier targets. So that's kind of interesting that it really just goes to the background of the people running the organization.
True. And on the consumer side, you know, we talk about smart TVs and the data that's retained there. You know, the disposal of our individual smart TVs when they're broken or obsolete, you know, that's important as a consumer.
All right. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. That's a good point.
Okay, so now we're going to resume for developing our policy. Some other considerations you might want to take note of, that who controls your media. So that you have to use this information to determine, put in your policy, whose responsibility is it for the control over and access to your media. And oftentimes this question is not very well considered or even has a good answer in an organization. So you have to have a responsibility. Everyone can't be doing their own thing. So that's why you have to have an overall umbrella policy to cover everything. The control of the media could be defined as when it's being returned as part of an end of the lease agreement, so it would be leaving your site, or if you're donating it or selling it for reuse outside of your organization. Also, the data protection level is something else you need to consider. And this is kind of an interesting example, is that you could have varying data protection policies that exist within the same organization. So say your company has an engineering department and a sales department. But the sales personnel may not need to access proprietary technical data, such as the source codes or schematics, drawings, what have you. And the engineers, on the other hand, don't necessarily have a need to access personal information of the company's customers that the sales department maintains. So in light of that responsibilities continuing on, this says that the overall responsibility with creating and maintaining your effective procedures and policies, it lies with your senior managers. And they have to ensure that adequate resources are available to locate the information and to identify it and so on and so forth. But that being said, it's obviously, like most things, the responsibility of each end user of the data to know what confidentiality level of the information they're dealing with is for their projects. And then you have to use that knowledge to handle the data properly. This is a very important point in that you probably have to stress to your employees that they have information at their fingertips that isn't something they should be sharing with their neighbors or their friends or their relatives. So it's important that the data end users know what they're dealing with at that point. So NIST specifies certain techniques for getting rid of your data. And basically, they're clear, purge, and destroy. Those are the categories. And they differ a bit in the fact that clear applies to the techniques you use to remove all of the data from the addressable storage locations. And it protects your media against just simple data recovery techniques. But so it uses an overwriting technique. As purge then applies the physical or logical techniques to render your data infeasible, but to a different level so that people using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques wouldn't be able to access your data. And then finally, destroy makes the data inaccessible to everybody because you can't reuse the media for storage. So you're destroying your media. Destroying media fully and properly ensures the data can't be accessed, but then also prevents you from reusing any of your drives. So a few more decision-making factors that you should consider in when developing your policy is that you have to start, again, like we said, by identifying the types of data stored on a device, and then choose the technique that preserves the confidentiality of the data. That, again, is the main goal. You can consider lots of other factors, but you're trying to protect this data from unauthorized release. So here, though, you also want to consider the length of time that you need to hold on to this data. So does it need to be kept for 3 years? Are there records that you want to keep indefinitely? Certain policies, like SOX and HIPAA, will require you to keep things for a certain amount of time. That should all be factored into your decision. And then, so then the next consideration is that you could use purge or clear, but there are sometimes better choices when you're looking at the environment, because then you don't keep buying new media. But the expense of replacing your devices is something else you have to consider, because storage does not come cheaply. It's getting better. The prices have come down, but still. And then finally, the last point on this slide is your risk decision. Should that information get disclosed when it's not supposed to be to the general public? And you hear about this happening all the time. So what would happen in your organization if the data is accidentally released? And depending on what data that is, this could be catastrophic in a lot of cases. So then NIST talks about you're doing all of this data destruction and you're sanitizing your media. And what does all of that mean unless you have documentation to show that you've completed everything? So you should have a certificate of media disposition. That could either be a hard copy or an electronic record. It does not matter which. And the information supplied on that certificate should be the media information, like the manufacturer and model serial number of the drives. The serial number in particular is very important to track the drive. Then there's system information. So like if the drive came out of a laptop or a desktop, does that computer have a property tag or an ID number that's part of your internal system? You should have the description of how the media was sanitized and how the data was removed. The method used, in this case, it's more if you're doing a destruction, those are destruction methods listed, and we could talk about that in a little bit later. The verification method, so if you're wiping a drive, not only do you have to show that you erased it, but there are verification methods that have to be followed. And then, of course, you would want a record of the date and time and the location where all this took place, and the name and title, and most importantly, the signature of whoever is performing the work. Maintaining the certificates is something else you need to consider for part of your destruction policy. Where are they kept, these certificates, if they're hard copies, and who's responsible for maintaining them?
Okay, on the screen, we have a sample of a physical destruction report, and we provide these to our clients because sometimes they've never seen those before. What does it actually look like? And in those situations, you're focusing on what method or process is being used in the actual physical destruction, like shredded or crushed. We have a small crusher, it's about 90 pounds. We're able to bring it into an office and actually crush drives on site. Employees are able to witness that if that's part of their policy. That's better than them going out to the parking lot to a shred truck when it's 10 degrees above zero and have to witness drives being shredded. The destruction report identifies that process, also the serial numbers of the drives, and the document is signed by, in this example, our company that attests that they were destroyed. This is on the screen now is a data destruction report for electronic wiping of drives. The software is really interesting because it references the individual serial numbers, the capacity, and also the date that they were wiped and if they were failed or passed based on the condition of the drive. The software does not allow us to get fancy and footnote any drives with any specific information. It's because when they wipe drives, that data is reported and it cannot be altered. This report from an electronic wiping standpoint is very thorough and concrete and locked in for our clients. Here are destruction certificates, if you're wondering what those look like, for both physical destruction as well as electronic data destruction. Just a quick example of those. Developing your policy. It's easy with all the information we've presented so far that your eyes roll back and you say, how do I even start with this? This NIST document, the 800-88, gives three appendices that we've referenced here that help you put this together. It's really not that bad as long as you surround yourself with some smart people to help set it up, some good vendors. You're able to really rough in a policy fairly quickly, and these appendices help you do that. If your next question is, well, how do I divide this policy up? Well, here's a great slide. You take a legal pad and you put these components on the left side, and then on the right side, you just kind of expand on them in bullet points as far as how you want to handle each one of these line items. And Jennifer talked about some of those a little bit ago, but, roles and responsibilities, destruction methods. You have a company like ours come in and we talk to you about the different ones that are available. And then as far as any media control, as far as your inventory of your assets, that helps you get started in order to put this policy together. Some of the practical applications, I mentioned the inventory list. You want to determine what the device type is. You want to define those pretty simply if they're desktops, laptops, phones. You can get as detailed or as top level as you want it, but that's usually a good start. We provided a sample inventory list from our company. Obviously, we don't have that many assets, but at the same time, it gives you the format as far as location, the owner, the serial number, the quantity, and the device type. Just a simple Excel schedule, and you're able to track that. And probably in some cases, matching that up to your fixed asset schedule is good as well. The next CPE question is sound data destruction policy will address the creation and maintenance of what? And we'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Okay, so we'll move on to the next subject, and that's disposal and destruction techniques.
So the next few slides give just a little bit more information when you're trying to determine in your policy what you want to do with your destruction methods. And this first one is data wiping or overwriting. And then it's pretty self-explanatory. You erase the data. It's from the storage media by writing meaningless data, and that could be patterns of zeros and ones, or it could be a phrase over and over again. But basically, that replaces all the data that exists on your drives that was previously stored. So you're overwriting everything. Now, depending on the standard used, sometimes the software will rewrite to the disk more than once, to the drive more than once. And so this process leaves the media fully functional. So you could use it again if you wanted to. The clear definition of overwriting actually writes to the drive once, and whereas in many cases the purge definition would write to the drive 3 times. So the same thing over 3 times. Obviously that takes a little bit of time. The advantages of this technique of data wiping or overwriting is that it gives you a great audit trail. So that was what Kevin had mentioned before, is that you have that report from the software and it shows every single serial number and when it was wiped and the time, the date, so on and so forth. It's a very secure method. And but some of the disadvantages are that it is very time consuming. So like we talked about before, if you have a 2 terabyte drive and you have to rewrite it 3 times, a lot of times a 2 terabyte drive to just overwrite once would be about probably 4 to 5 hours. So if you're doing that 3 times, you're talking about an entire day into the evening as far as time goes. Also, it's a little complex, and when you have a software that does that, so you need to have your employees trained so that they're doing it correctly. And there's a footnote on this page that this overwriting process is something that you should be doing, but you should never, as Bill had mentioned before, use file deletion, disk reformatting, or operating system reinstallation to consider your method of destroying your data, because that does not destroy the actual data, as Bill mentioned before. And it's highly retrievable at that point, even by anybody off the street. So then the next couple of slides are just going to talk about physical destruction, and basically there's degaussing. Now, degaussing is one of those physical destruction techniques that we talked about earlier, is not applicable to all types of media. So if you have a hard drive, then you could go ahead and degauss it, because on the spinning platters, there's magnetic data, and then that's what degaussing does, is that it applies a tense magnetic field to your data to get rid of it. But if you had a solid state drive, then degaussing is completely useless. It wouldn't help you at all. So the advantage of this is that it's very easy to do. There's a lot of degaussing instruments out there, or equipment that you put the drive kind of like in a disk. You put the drive in like a drawer and you close it, and then it does its magic. It doesn't take very long. There's no waste. And so it's pretty easy to do. But one of the major disadvantages is that there's no visual feedback. So you can't tell by looking at a drive, just by looking at it, whether anything was done to it or not. So that's degaussing. Another physical destruction method is shredding. And it is exactly what like you think it would be, is that you use a shredder to destroy your media. And in the case of certain SSDs, then they have chips on them, so it has to be destroyed by a specific shredder. You can't just put it through your office shredder. That doesn't work in order to destroy it correctly. So again, shredding is pretty easy to execute. Obviously, you have very, very strong visual confirmation. Anybody can look at a drive that's been shredded and know that it has been, and it's fairly widely accepted. But on the flip side of that, it's kind of a dirty process. I don't know if anyone's ever shredded a drive, either an HDD or an SSD, but you end up with a lot of metal particles and fragments, and it could become very, very messy over time. And then you have to do something with all of that waste. And then there's one of the other physical destruction methods is crushing, and this is an example of the crushing unit that we have. And basically you take, it does exactly what you would think. You put your drive in there, and then you have this wedge, it's a stainless steel wedge that comes down with an inordinate amount of force, and it cracks the casing on your drive, and it bends the platters. in half so that they cannot be taken out and then spun up again. The process for this is a little bit different when you do crushing of solid state drives because they don't have the platters, they have the chips. And then so there's a special attachment to this unit where it has 90 spikes basically, and it pokes holes, 90 holes in your SSD drive. So the advantage of this is that this unit is portable and you can bring it on site and use it at somebody's office. Obviously visual confirmation is high in this technique, and it's fairly easy to do, but then it's a little bit slower than some other techniques. And most importantly, your operator has to be trained to inspect the drives because you have to make sure that those platters are bent. You can't just take it out and toss it for disposal. Every single drive has to be inspected thoroughly to make sure that this technique has been completed properly.
Okay, and then we have the last CPE question there in front of you. And if I could just take a few minutes, I wanted to expand a little bit on what Jennifer just presented and what we've talked about a little earlier. This slide deck is really beneficial, and I want to thank Bill Heaven and Michelle for putting it together. It actually is a great document to start the conversation amongst your internal leadership team at your client, at the client's location. It allows you to educate yourself on the terms and the layout of developing your own policy and to assemble some good questions. I think that's step one. Step two then is for a company to look in the mirror and say, okay, this is what I have, this is what I don't have. Here are some of the risk areas that could get us in trouble, and how do I mitigate those risks or eliminate them? And then the next step is to bring in some vendors and talk to them about data destruction and IT recycling and get some ideas of how you would want to destroy that data. Now, a lot of companies have solutions on how to destroy it, but what works best for you is what you need to decide as your own individual company. And the way you get those answers is you surround yourself with some vendors that give you good information, and then also fall in line with the NIST 800 series that Jennifer went through in detail. So it's not as difficult as it might seem after.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. Is that it seems overwhelming, especially when you go and look at all of these slides. But we did develop our own policy for Northern Shores for our company, and you look at it and you're like, where do I start with this? Well, you have an outline of a procedure, and then you have some of those. One of the slides shows the different points that you should add, and then like Kevin said, you just start there and then fill in as you go along. I think the other thing is too is that it's probably hard if you have a very large organization to figure out how to do this all at once, but you may want to get input from your various different departments who may have different data destruction needs, and then put all that together in a general policy.
A quick story, we have a great client relationship with a government entity, and the way we met them is the gentleman took over as their IT director and had a whole office room filled with IT assets, and in some cases loose drives, in some cases drives within assets. And he needed to first destroy the data, but then also recycle and dispose of the assets, but he had no idea what they had. So we got together with him and we went into the office room and did an inventory of everything that was in that office. And then we went ahead and created a chain of custody with the individual serial numbers of the loose drives. And then we created a report that tied the individual drive serial numbers with the assets that we took them out of. So you end up with a pretty good inventory report of loose drives, IT assets, and the ones that had data in them and the ones did not, and then followed it up with destruction certificates after that. Now, because they were a government entity, they were able to paper the file, so to speak, on what was destroyed by serial number. So I guess there's an example where you have a problem, you don't really have the team members to take it over and to handle it. So through a vendor and leadership of that entity, we were able to come out on top as far as data destruction and a complete inventory as far as what was recycled. So, so I guess there's an example when the problem gets a little too big and you're wondering how to resolve it, that there's one possible solution there. So, Bill, I didn't know if you had any other questions or something we might have missed.
So we can open it up to questions here, but one of the takeaways that when we were preparing for this, we were saying like, what's really changed? But the thing that really sticks out to me is those, the acceptance of those SDD drives. That seems to have thrown a little bit of a wrinkle into it because, like Jennifer was talking about the destruction tool where it's got all those pins coming down to make sure that it hits that chip.
Yes.
So
yes.
that seems like those SDD, because everything's moving that way because they're a superior performing drive, but it seems like it's added a little wrinkle into the destruction side. And Kevin, you mentioned that one client that gives it to the sheriff's department to shoot holes in it, but if they don't hit that chip, then that drive's really...
There's many chips, right? So they would not be good target practice candidates because, I mean, even in an HDD with the spinning platters, if you're a really bad shot, you could miss the platter. So obviously we don't those methods, but you're right. A lot more solid state drives are being used all over the place, and they require certain physical destruction, very specific.
Right. Yeah, so that would be a good reason why people should call you guys up to make sure their data is being destroyed properly. So that was a big takeaway for me. And the other thing that I was noticing is, the importance of the inventory. And I've done separate webinars on like performing risk assessments and making sure you know what software you have as well as what hardware. So it's another big takeaway for me, that how important that inventory is, because if you don't know what inventory you have, you don't really know what risk you're exposed to. So that's by you guys highlighting that, it makes it, I think it reinforced it for me, just being in this industry, knowing how important an inventory is. But those are just some examples that you guys were going through to kind of get that to the audience of that's really where they need to start.
Yeah, that's very true. It's a little easier than you would like to think for somebody to walk through your office and pick up a drive. And if you don't even know what you had to begin with, then you certainly wouldn't know what would be missing. So that's very true, is that inventory of logging things is where everything starts.
Right. All right, I really appreciate you guys coming on and doing this webinar with us. I think it was an awesome webinar, great content for everyone. But Michelle, have any questions come into you while we've been gabbing away here?
The one question that did come in is, why is the serial number capture for hard drives and IT assets so important?
I'll defer that to one of the Northern Shores folks, either Kevin or Jennifer.
I guess the best example is you have a box of 10 drives, and they all have serial numbers. And if you don't have the serial numbers written down, and one of those hard drives are out there in the market and there's a data breach, they're going to trace it to that hard drive and that serial number. And if you don't have that serial number tied to a destruction certificate, then you can't prove that you destroyed the data or you paid for someone to destroy the data. And that's why that serial number is important. A lot of our clients, some feel it's important, some do not, but you never know if it's a problem unless there's a data breach. And one of the things I remind our clients, that they'll say that, well, I never heard of data breaches in our area. And that's because no one's going to announce it. No one is going to say, hey, I've had a data breach and let's put it on the news. They just don't do that. So it's better to be proactive than to be reactive.
And so that basically would become a liability for that company that didn't destroy the drive if it's proven that that's where the breach, happened from,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, because at that time, and it could be years later, but you wouldn't have the record showing that you properly destroyed the data.
How long do you have to keep the records of the destruction? Is there like a, like you have to keep tax returns for 7 years? Is there a
That's a little more dependent on the industry and the regulatory. We didn't talk a whole lot about regulatory guidance of your industry, but obviously every industry has somebody there's regulations that they have to follow, and so it would follow suit with the however long you're supposed to keep most records as far as your industry goes, whether you're in finance or healthcare or manufacturing is a little less, I think, strict.
Right.
But like if you're in healthcare, nursing homes, doctors' offices, what have you, obviously the HIPAA laws are very specific in retention policies.
Great, good advice. Any other questions out there, Michelle?
No, that is all.
Okay, great. Well, if anybody has any, our contact information is up on the screen. If anybody thinks of anything after we sign off here, please feel free to reach out to myself or Jennifer or Kevin, and we'll, we'll do our best to address your concern. But again, I would really like to thank Jennifer and Kevin for helping us out today. I think it was an awesome webinar, and really appreciate it. And for the people that are on the line, I'll send out I'll give you a reminder that our September webinar is going to be the fourth Wednesday, which is September 27th, again from 10 to 11, and we're going to have a guest speaker of our Vertilocity MSP group. So we'll be sending out an invite, within the next couple of weeks on that. But thanks again for attending, and another shout out to Jennifer and Kevin for helping us out. So give you a couple minutes early of your day back, and thanks a lot, and everybody have a great day.
Thanks, Bill. Take care. Goodbye.
Thanks. Goodbye.